Ida B. Wells' activism really stems from her career as a journalist. And she began to raise the question about why lynching occurred in the South, and particularly to challenge the stereotype of lynching being a result of African-American men raping white women.
In the early 1900s, major Hollywood film companies portrayed African Americans through negative stereotypes. White performers were made up in blackface. The goal was to create the impression that African Americans were inferior. These movies increased racial hatred and were a factor in sporadic racial rioting and lynchings of this period.
Blacks had been depicted in movies, in books, and basically in the public media as beasts, as individuals that were on the edges or fringes of barbarism, individuals that attacked white women indiscriminately. And white men took it upon themselves to sponsor a holy crusade against blacks.
Under God, I have done work without any assistance from my own people. And when I think that I have been able to do the work with His assistance that you could not do if you would, and you would not do if you could, I think I have a right to a feeling of strong indignation. With that, I walked out of the meeting and left them sitting with their mouths open.
Blacks never did really have an opportunity economically to get back into mainstream America.
The end of the Civil War on April 9, 1865, also ended 246 years of slavery for over 4 million African Americans under oppression by white power. Legally stopped from education and economic opportunities under captivity, the race moved swiftly to take advantage of new rights extended under the Constitution. President Abraham Lincoln and Congress passed landmark legislation.
One of the things that we'll find is that Lincoln, in his Emancipation Proclamation, was definitely paying attention to not offending the South, but at the same time ridding the nation of that stain of black slavery.
But Southern states, however, resented this new black equality and worked to undermine national laws during this period known as Reconstruction, from 1865 to 1875. Hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged and used violent methods such as lynching to discourage African Americans from exercising their new rights. The race was voting in large numbers to elect legislators that delivered benefits in their neighborhoods. But white Southern racists were fearful that African Americans would gain too much political and economic power. So they took steps, often violent, to take the vote and suppress freedom. African Americans who dared to vote were injured or murdered. But this didn't frighten them off. They kept voting to elect men like Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, who served as state senator and lieutenant governor of Louisiana during Reconstruction.
One of the things that blacks found was that even though they had been given rights by the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, they found that the Supreme Court, this time the highest court in the land, is really not committed to effectively give blacks or to assure that blacks have these opportunities.
The national government ignored these blatant violations against African Americans. Rights that the race had earned were taken away by 1900 in the South. Frequent violence against them grew. It became commonplace. Racist white mobs went on killing sprees, murdering unarmed African American men, women, and children. Lynching happened so often that it became an accepted reality in African American life. The perpetrators were not stopped by legal authorities at the state or federal levels.
Ida B. Wells, born into slavery, rose to challenge this brutality, and her work brought worldwide attention to the lynching issue. Born July 16, 1862 in Holly Springs, Mississippi, she was the oldest of 8 children. Her parents, both former slaves, strongly stressed education and self-esteem to their children. Because of this kind of nurturing, Wells had a great thirst for knowledge. She graduated from Rust College in Holly Springs and stretched herself by taking extra classes whenever she could to sharpen her skills. After passing the teaching test by the fall of 1884, Wells was teaching in Memphis City schools. She also wrote for a church paper, and her talents attracted the attention of the Free Speech newspaper. They made her an offer to be an editor, and she accepted. Her brief teaching career ended in 1891 when Wells was fired in the all-black Memphis school system for writing an article in the Free Speech that criticized the poor conditions for students. After being dismissed, she started writing full-time, and she saved what she could to buy an interest in the newspaper. Traveling on one of her regular trips for subscribers in Natchez, Mississippi in 1892, she heard about another horrible lynching in Memphis. This time, 3 African-American males who owned a business had been murdered by a white mob. They were close friends of Wells. During this era, African-Americans who dared to go into business risked being killed.